Welcome everyone to this session on theoretical and operational measurement. In psychology research, we study abstract constructs or concepts. For example, intelligence, memory, generosity, self-control, or stress. And for us to be able to do research, we need a way to measure these abstract constructs. Some variables can be objectively measured with scientific instruments. For example, if you want to measure if sitting in the sun changes your cat's temperature, you can use a thermometer. So the temperature is the theoretical construct that you're interested in, and the way you measure it is by using the thermometer. So we need to operationalize a theoretical construct to be able to measure it. So this seems quite obvious in this example, but the variables we want to measure in psychology are often not as straightforward to measure. So for example, if you want to measure self-control, you might decide to look at how long your participants keep trying to work on a hard puzzle, or how long they can avoid laughing at a funny movie, or you get them to do some sort of physical task where they have to grip a grip master for as long as possible. And studies like this have found ways to measure self-control in animals. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of different ways to look at this. For example, intelligence can be measured by looking at standardized IQ test scores. Memory might be measured through the number of correctly recalled words or images, faces, whatever you're using in that specific study. Self-control, like we mentioned, might be the number of completed puzzles before someone gives up. Generosity might be measured by the amount someone donates to charity. Stress could be measured by self-reported stress levels using a 7-point scale, and could even measure something more controversial like mind reading ability by using the center test, for example, where the participant has to guess which card the researcher has been looking at. And variables can be either dependent or independent. So the dependent variable is typically measured as an outcome variable, and the independent variable could be measured to be used as a grouping variable. So for example, we might test people's generosity levels and then split them into two groups based on that. Or it can be manipulated, for example, by having people do something stressful versus a control group, which wouldn't do something stressful. When research is reported in the media, we often tend to get the theoretical level. So we might see headlines like this: chaos improves self-discipline, study finds. And if the headline was written from the operational level, it might look more like this: people who spend 5 minutes in a messy room were less likely to accept a free pen than people in a tidier room. So sometimes the headline can be more impressive than the method. Operational definitions of concepts can sometimes be problematic. So by reducing complex concepts into a simpler measure, sometimes we miss meaningful and subjective perceptions. Using context-specific operationalizations can make it hard to compare studies, and findings may not generalize to other contexts. Finally, concepts may vary across time periods and across different social settings. What happens if our operationalization isn't measuring what we're trying to measure, or doesn't work beyond the specific context or people in our study? It means that conclusions from our studies are likely to be misleading, and conducting this research might also be a waste of resources, including researcher time and money. The quality of our operationalization determines the quality of our research. Let's talk about some different kinds of operational measures. We've got self-report measures, biological measures, measures of task or test performance, and measures of behavior. Examples of self-report would be presenting participants with different statements, such as, I am calm, I am happy, I am generous, I am creative, my memory is good, I am intelligent. I feel like I just got my daily positive affirmations done accidentally, but you show participants statements and ask them to rate the extent to which they agree with the statement. And to assess feelings and experiences, opinions, it often makes sense to ask the person directly. But of course, sometimes the responses might be influenced by how the participant wants to come across, social desirability bias. Biological measures include physiological responses, such as heart rate, hormones, eye movements, and neurological responses, brain activity. And these responses are typically not within conscious control. And sometimes biological measures are seen as being more objective, as they may be less likely to be influenced by how the participant wants to come across. Other times we use a test or a task to measure the variable of interest. So for example, we show participants a bunch of words, and then later on we test their memory of those words. And this is typically suitable for measuring ability, for example, cognitive ability. Finally, we can assess variables by observing participants' behavior. For example, we can measure generosity by how much money people donate. This still involves some decisions about how to score the occurrence of the behavior. For example, is it the amount of money? Is it how quickly they donate? Is it whether they donate or not? And so on. Sometimes in psychology there is a tension between subjective and objective measures. So if we want to assess learning in a university course, a subjective measure might be asking students to report how much they feel like they learned. A more objective measure might be looking at how well the students perform in the exam. Sometimes we might assume that a more objective measure is always better. But I think that the key question to ask yourself is whether the measure provides a meaningful answer to the research question. So, as an example, imagine that a treatment of depression changed brain activity, but not the subjective experiences of depression as reported by participants. Or a dementia treatment did not improve memory scores on a test, but the family members reported an improvement in their loved one's memory. Or perhaps less screen time makes parents rate their teenagers as happier, but the teenagers did not smile more. So the key thing to keep in mind is that however we operationalize the construct of interest, it should provide a meaningful answer to the theoretical question. Sometimes an objective measure might make more sense, but in other cases, something more subjective might actually be more meaningful. Now we'll talk about how to critically assess the operationalizations that you come across in research studies. The key question to ask yourself is whether the leap from the theoretical to the operational level seems reasonable. But keep in mind that researchers are typically not claiming that the measure fully or perfectly measures the construct, or that it is the only way to measure it. The first step, and perhaps the most important, is to specify exactly what was measured. So make sure that you go through the method section and notice exactly what was done. For example, is it how quickly participants ate a marshmallow? Is it whether they ate it or not? Or is it how many marshmallows they ate? Then you'll be able to assess whether this specific measure seems to be a reasonable or a close enough operationalization of the theoretical construct. Reasonable in this context will probably not mean perfect, but it would mean that the measure meaningfully captures at least some aspect of the theoretical construct. And please think about whether you have a better suggestion. So a strong critical evaluation wouldn't simply say this measure isn't perfect or this measure isn't complete, but it would also offer a suggestion. So for example, if you think an issue is that the measure is too subjective or it doesn't seem to generalize to the real world, you could say that and suggest using a different kind of measure that would address those specific problems. Relatedly, you can assess whether the specific measure seems generalizable to other contexts. So as an example, a study might measure scarcity by manipulating the number of tokens participants get in an online poker game. This does seem to measure scarcity, having more or less, but do you think that this measure would generalize to real life scarcity, such as poverty? If the paper talks about poverty and the effects of poverty in the introduction and in discussion, and perhaps makes strong claims about this based on their findings using this poker game operationalization, that might be something that you want to comment on in your critical reflection and something that is worth unpacking. Think about how the measure might be perceived by the participants. Is it kind of obvious what is being measured, and is that a problem? So for example, if you walk into a research study and you find a bunch of money on the floor, would you suspect that that is actually part of the study? And would that influence how you respond to the money? So sometimes when the hypothesis is obvious, that influences how participants perform in the study or how they interact with the researcher. And this is known as demand characteristics, and we'll talk more about that in the next session. But this is something to keep in mind when you think about the measure. If it is very unnatural or it seems very forced, it might influence how the participants perform and react. Think about whether the measure captures additional constructs beyond the intended one. So confound means to mix something up with something else so that the individual elements become difficult to distinguish. In research, we talk about confounding factors. So that would be a variable that influences both the dependent and the independent variables, causing a spurious association. So for example, if we're measuring self-control by looking at whether participants laugh at a funny movie or not, this might also capture participants' mood. So that could introduce a confound if, for example, we have manipulated the sleep participants got the night before. So we want to see whether this influences their self-control, but actually the participants who are more sleep deprived might be in a bad mood, and then that might be why they're not laughing at the funny movie. So that's just one example of how a operational version of a construct might also capture something else. Consider whether the measure is seen as reliable by other researchers and experts. In other words, what is known about the psychometric properties, that is the validity and the reliability of the measure. And we'll talk more about validity and reliability as this course goes on. But for now, it's worth knowing that for some measures, such as standard intelligence tests and personality tests, there have been decades of research exploring the validity and reliability, whereas other measures might be new. So researchers might have made this up themselves, essentially, and that would be noticeable if the paper does not cite past research or other research using those measures or similar measures. And often researchers will use a modified version of measures used by others. And finally, you can assess the strengths and weaknesses of using this type of measure to assess the theoretical construct. So like we mentioned before, researchers may rely on self-report or biological measure, task performance, or observed behavior. So as an example, if they are using self-reported IQ scores, that might not be very useful for getting at actual cognitive ability. And it's worth reflecting on whether the study would seem more meaningful or more reliable if a different type of measure was used. So hopefully by now you've gotten some inspiration and some ideas about how to critically assess operationalizations in different research papers that you come across. But it's easy to take all this and apply it and be too critical. So while I do encourage you to think critically about what exactly was measured and how well this measure captures the theoretical construct, and whether findings are likely to meaningfully generalize to other contexts, try not to expect any one measure or any one study to perfectly capture any theoretical construct in psychology. And also avoid harshly criticizing measures if you can't offer a better, feasible suggestion and justify why your suggestion is better, pinpointing what exactly you are suggesting needs to be improved. And also don't assume that a study is worthless or completely unreliable because the measures have some limitations. This is normal, and it's common in research, as you will be aware. So just to leave you with some key questions to use in your critical evaluation. So ask yourself whether the theoretical construct of interest is measured appropriately. In other words, does the step from the theoretical to the operational level seem reasonable? And also consider strengths and weaknesses of the specific type of measure that was used in relation to the theoretical construct that was measured. Thank you for listening.